Welcome
You've had
to Welcome to Kids Yoga Academy, another one of our live webinar events. My name is Donna Freeman. I am the founder of Kids Yoga Academy and Yoga in My School. It is my pleasure to be able to offer these training webinars to interested and engaged professionals from around the world. We are working toward the health and welfare of our children, and it is a wonderful job to be engaged in, and the community is large and vast, and we are so blessed tonight to have Jennifer Cohen Harper as our guest presenter. And I just want to let you know that in order to communicate with either Jennifer or myself, we are both on social media. We both have email addresses, and that's usually the best way to get in touch with us. So one of those two ways. I'm sure you can like Little Flower Yoga on Facebook as well. You can like Kids Yoga Academy. Let us know what you thought of this evening's presentation, and I know Jennifer's going to knock it out of the park. I've been to a conference with Jennifer, was totally impressed with her, and she is truly one of the people at the forefront of educating professionals to work with children and to bring mindfulness practices into their lives. Tonight's topic is teaching trauma-informed yoga for children, or sensitizing your classes for children who have experienced trauma. This is a rich topic, and we're going to let Jennifer get right into it because she has lots to share. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Donna. So welcome, everybody. It's very strange not to be in the room together and be able to see your faces. So why don't we just take 1 minute to sit together quietly, and maybe we can imagine being in a room together and see if we can commit ourselves to trying to stay present with each other, even through this strange technology format. Just try to commit ourselves to being really present for this hour. So I'm just going to be quiet for just about 1 minute so that we can gather ourselves together, and then you'll hear the sound of the bell and we will dive right in. Thank you for that. So teaching trauma-informed yoga for children, I have to start with the disclaimer that we have one very short hour to talk about some very, very big ideas, a very big topic. So I'm going to give you the information that I think is the most useful and the most helpful for you in this time period. I'm sure that there'll be a lot of questions. As Donna said, you can be in touch with us anytime. So please don't feel like you have to get every question in just this hour. So trauma, what is trauma? So sometimes we think about trauma as this idea of really bad things happening. And really bad things happen to everyone, right? We can't, and none of us can escape the fact that we are living a mortal life, and the people that we love are living a mortal life. Trauma is part of the human experience in a lot of ways, but bad things happen all the time, and we aren't all necessarily walking through the world in a state of being traumatized. So what do we mean? What are we talking about when we're talking about kids who've experienced trauma and working with kids who've experienced trauma? What I'm talking about in this presentation, and what I think about when I think in terms of working with kids who've experienced trauma, is kids for whom life has become overwhelming. Something has happened to them that has overwhelmed their normal ability to cope. Not just something was terrible and I felt bad about it, but completely overwhelmed their ability to cope. I'm talking about kids for whom their foundation of safety in the world, their sense of the world is basically a safe place for me, has been threatened, sometimes obliterated. And also kids who have a reduced sense of agency, a reduced or, again, sometimes obliterated belief in their own ability for meaningful action in the world. They don't necessarily believe that their decisions and their actions have any bearing on what happens to them. So horrible things happen, traumatic things happen, and the stories of those traumatic things are usually things that we don't know, right? We don't always know the stories of what's happened to our kids. But what we can try to understand, and what I've found it more useful to understand, even when I don't know the circumstances, is to try to pay attention to the sense of how our kids are trying to protect themselves. How are we trying to protect ourselves when something horrible happens to us? So whether or not we internalize something as traumatic and how it impacts our life moving forward is in many ways dependent not just on what has happened to us, but how we try to protect ourselves and how successful that attempt at protecting ourselves was. So understanding the experience of your students who've been through trauma is not just about hearing their stories, it's also about understanding their attempts to cope. And to me, one of the most useful ways to understand how people respond to trauma is through Stephen Porges' polyvagal theory. This is a theory that describes the stages of fear response in any person. So the vagus nerve, the vagal nerve, might be familiar to a lot of you if you are in the yoga world, because we often hear about practices such as pranayama stimulating the vagus nerve. Well, the reason we hear about that as such a good thing is because the vagus nerve wanders throughout our body, connecting to every major organ. This is interesting as it relates to trauma and the fear response. When you look at Stephen Porges' work and you look at our kids. So Stephen Porges talks about the first stage of responding to fear as social engagement. So something happens, and what our natural tendency to do is, what our kids' natural tendency to do is to connect with each other, to call for help, to cry, to communicate distress, to seek safety and support in other people. So when that works, when something scary happens to us and we reach out for support, then usually we're not walking through the world in a traumatized state, right? We acted, we responded to something scary, and we reached out for social engagement. Somebody was on our side, right? And for our kids, other people, adults, showed up to support them and protect them during the scary things. When that happens, the scary things don't become traumatizing because the body system for protection is working, and you can walk through the world with the feeling that bad things can happen, but other people are on your side and you can be okay. Now, what happens when this normal fear response, this social engagement response, isn't working, either because no one has shown up to help you, or sometimes because the threat is too serious for social engagement to help? What happens is that the body turns to the next step, the next stage in the emergency response system, which is our sympathetic nervous system response, or our fight or flight response. So if you think back, or you have in your handout that chart of the vagus nerve, that first level of social engagement can see the vagal nerve wandering down from the brain and moving forward into the face, all the nerve endings that are in the front, the face is called the ventral vagal system. So you experience something scary and all those nerves come right into the world through your face. Well, in this next step, this fight or flight response, this sympathetic nervous system response, we're digging a little deeper, and we follow the vagus nerve down to our heart, to our lungs, and we engage, right? We fight, we run away. So when this system is activated, because the social engagement system for protection is not working, we respond instinctually, impulsively, and when our kids are in this place where people haven't shown up to keep them safe, when threats are serious enough to push them to this level of engagement with the world, what happens is that they become more likely to perceive things as a threat, even if they're neutral, even if they're not actually threatening, because they're in a heightened state of reactivity. So they're more likely to respond with aggression or withdrawal rather than engagement. One of the hallmarks of this state is that emotional responses are not necessarily consistent with what's really happening. So for kids who learn early on in their life that people can't necessarily be counted on for protection, this fight or flight response, this sympathetic nervous system response, often becomes their default mode. They stop attempting social engagement, and things that feel even a little bit threatening or a little bit overwhelming are often met with a sympathetic nervous response. And I think a lot of the kids that, a lot of the kids that I work with are stuck in this place, and my guess is that if you're on this call, a lot of the kids that you work with are stuck in this place too, where from a young age they've learned that that social engagement level of self-protection may not exactly be enough to keep them safe. So there's another level of fear engagement, which is what happens when nobody's coming to help you, or the people who come to help you can't help you, right? There's a threat that you can't fight. There's a threat that you can't run away from. This next level of fear protection is the freeze or collapse response. So this is what happens when the threat cannot be met in any productive way, right? The most traumatizing things that you experience, and your system is completely overwhelmed. This is what happens often if someone is trapped, someone's incapacitated. You can't fight, you can't run away, which if you think about what happens for kids in situations of abuse or in really a lot of traumatic situations for kids, because they are they're kids, right? So they're by definition vulnerable and not as capable of effective action as adults may be, right? So when you can't fight, you can't run away, you're trapped, you're incapacitated, there's no way to deal with the threat in any sort of productive way, then the only option that's left is for you to withdraw, right, for the system to collapse. So this, if you look at that chart of the vagus nerve, if you look to kind of the deepest levels of where the vagus nerve connects to all of our major organs, in the most dramatic version of this freeze or collapse or withdraw response, blood flow is reduced, our metabolism slows down, and the body goes into a sort of shock to protect the self from what's happening. So this is the most dramatic stage of our attempt to protect ourselves. So often when a child has experienced a traumatic event, or frequently a series of traumatic events, what happens is they're acting in the world through an altered nervous system. So their brain and their nervous system basically adapt to a new worldview that tells them, I am not safe. Right? The world is not a safe place for me. I am not safe in it. And when that starts to happen, I think of those kids as having an overprotective brain. Sometimes I even talk to my students about their protective brain, which is a part of them that they need, the part of them that helps them respond to their instincts when something doesn't feel safe, and helps protect them when they're nervous or afraid or threatened, versus the overprotective brain. And the overprotective brain is the brain that can't tell what's safe and what isn't. Right? The overprotective brain is a brain that has a hard time understanding what is safe in the world. It's likely to perceive even neutral events as threatening. And oftentimes in students, behavior that seems bewildering or aggressive or belligerent, if you look at those kids through this lens of they're acting in the world with a very overprotective brain, it can give us a lot of clarity so that we can accurately interpret their behavior as their attempt to protect themselves. So I do talk to my kids about their overprotective brain, and that's language that they respond to. That's language that they can understand, right? Our overprotective brain has a hard time really keeping us safe because our overprotective brain doesn't believe that social engagement is a useful strategy. And most of the things in the world that we come up against in day-to-day life, the healthiest way to deal with scary things in most situations is through some form of social engagement. So the overprotective brain is one that drives our kids straight to those places of fight or flight, right, aggression, withdrawal, disengagement. And so much of the work of yoga and the work that we do with our kids who've experienced trauma is about helping them re-engage, right, re-engage with their own selves and also re-engage with each other. So depending on the type of trauma your kids have experienced and how that child has attempted to protect him or herself and how those attempts at protecting the self were or were not effective, and of course also depending on kids' individual personality, what the experience of having been through a trauma might look like in a kid can manifest in so many different ways. It's very, very hard to look at a group of children and say, oh yeah, I can tell who's a trauma survivor here. It's really likely that you can't. But it is extremely likely that if you're working with groups of kids in any setting, you're working with trauma survivors. I'm not going to dive into all the statistics right now, but many, many, many children have experienced trauma, and many have experienced repeated chronic traumas. So it's very important that we internalize this idea that if we're working with groups of kids, we are working with trauma survivors, and you are not necessarily going to know who those kids are in the room. So I state that sort of vehemently and forcefully because now I'm going to show you this little list of what trauma might manifest as. This is definitely not the end of the story. It's very much the beginning of the story. But some things that you might commonly see happening with your kids that we give all sorts of other names to often are the remnants of their trauma history. So the first thing we have to mention is ADHD. There's a strong association between kids who've experienced trauma and ADHD-like symptoms. There's even been some suggestions in the medical profession around the relationship between trauma and ADHD being stronger than just looking like symptoms. So ADHD and trauma survivorness, it's not a word, but I'll use it, can look very, very similar. This doesn't mean I'm saying ADHD doesn't exist. But you should be aware that your kids who seem like they have ADHD may not. They may not need medication. They may be dealing with a trauma history. Others are things like severe behavior problems, including aggression, anger, sometimes even excessive joking around. What seems like excessive joking around can be what some kids manifest after having experienced trauma. Resistance to participation, withdrawal from the group. Sometimes trauma can look like excessive pleasing, where the child has basically become an expert at making him or herself into whatever the adult in the room wants them to be. This is really troubling. I mean, all of it's troubling, but the pleasing instinct is, I find it to be particularly hard because sometimes that kid just seems like a really, really good kid, and it's easy to overlook the fact that they might really be suffering or struggling. But when a kid's kind of quote-unquote goodness seems like it's overriding their authenticity, it's often because they don't feel entirely safe. And even if the behavior is not problematic, the kid is having a problem. So again, the main takeaway here is just to remember that you likely won't know that you're working with a trauma survivor when that person is right in front of you, unless they have happened to tell you. And their behavior may be very confusing to you. So for me, when I keep this information about trauma in the back of my mind in my work, and I recognize that the numbers of trauma survivors are very high, then I can come into a space and teach from a place of trauma sensitivity, which doesn't mean that I'm necessarily believing that every kid in front of me is a trauma survivor, but it helps me not jump to inaccurate conclusions about kids based on their behavior. So all of this being said, it is essential to remember you are definitely working with trauma survivors if you are working with groups of kids. And to teach with trauma sensitivity means that we maintain an awareness of this reality all of the time, right? That we filter our words, our actions, the choices that we make in our teaching through the lens of this reality, consciously working to reduce potential triggers, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and also reacting skillfully to the imprints of trauma manifesting in our students' behavior and in their attitude. We don't need to know our students' stories. We don't need to know their history in order to teach with trauma awareness and trauma sensitivity. So, how can we help? So yoga can have a very real, very tangible effect on both the resilience of children and on their capacity for recovery after a traumatic event. We're going to spend about the next half hour, 40 minutes or so talking about how we can shift our teaching of yoga to best support children who've experienced trauma. But I think there are two things that are very important to keep in mind as we dive into that conversation. The first is we are not therapists, right? We need to be there for our kids if they want to talk, but we're not therapists, unless, of course, maybe some of you are. But if your role is as a yoga instructor coming into a space, it's very important to remember that we're not working to heal our students' trauma through talk, right? Make sure that if they do talk with you about scary things or things that have happened to them, that you can hold that you can listen with love, with support, with non-judgment. You can be a safe person that they can be honest with, that they can talk to without fear. But it's not your job to talk them through their trauma. So if students reach out to you and share their story, just keep that in your mind. Be a safe space for them, but then reach out to others for help, therapists, counselors, and remind yourself that you're there with something that can support them, which is the yoga. Right? You don't have to be their therapist also. The other thing to keep in mind is that we need to get a little bit clearer about what we mean when we say the word trigger. So this is a word that's come up a lot in the yoga community lately. You hear it talked about a lot, like that was triggering, this was triggering, I don't want to trigger that kid. When we're talking about trauma work, the word trigger comes up an awful lot, but it is often used in kind of a wide variety of ways. Sometimes I hear people use that word kind of casually to mean something is upsetting. Right? They'll say, oh, that was very triggering to me. And what they really mean was that upset them. They didn't like it. Right? But what we're talking about specifically in this context is a trigger, not just something that bothers or upsets someone, but we're talking about something that triggers a flashback, an embodied re-experiencing of the trauma. So this isn't just a memory, a trigger. It's not something that reminds the child of something, but it's something that evokes an embodied, lived experience of its own. So when this happens, the child is taken out of the present moment and is not experiencing or reacting to the world as it is right now, but as it was then. So there are a lot of triggers, and common ones are certain kinds of touch, certain types of sounds, feelings or sensations in the body, things that change in the environment, going from light to dark, closing your eyes, sounds happening outside the room. So there are a lot of different things that for your kids who've experienced trauma might trigger them. It's going to be impossible to eliminate all of these things, but it is important that we pay attention to recognizing what's happening so that we really stay connected to our kids, tune into their experience, and if it seems like they're not really with us in the present moment, that we have in our mind not just, oh, that kid's daydreaming or she's not paying attention, and get annoyed, but really like look and say, is there something real that has taken this child out of the present moment? What are they experiencing right now? How can I help bring them back to the present moment? So when we are talking about working with kids who've experienced trauma and what the yoga can offer, I think primarily about two things, which is rebuilding a sense of safety and a sense of agency. So that sense of safety, what I'm talking about is safety in our own bodies, safety in relationship with others, and safety in the environment around us. I'm talking about a reconnection with present moment reality and the ability for these kids to start to learn again to distinguish between what's safe and what isn't. So remember that for a child who's experienced a trauma, the nervous system is often set to a particularly sensitive place. And when we can offer yoga practices from a perspective of mindful awareness, of recognizing what's happening in the moment and noticing how our nervous system responds, we can help our kids start shifting to a place where they are living once again in the present moment. So one of the significant ways that yoga can begin to help cultivate a sense of safety and this recalibrating of the nervous system is through breath work. So we hear this talked about a lot, right? When you breathe through your nose slowly, especially when you breathe through your nose with an emphasis on the exhale, you stimulate the vagus nerve and soothe the sympathetic nervous system. You help your kids calm their fight or flight response in their physical body. So that, if I, in this 1 hour, if I can say, okay, focus on one practice for your kids who've experienced trauma, I would say if I was working with kids who've experienced trauma and could only do one thing, it would be help them recognize when they're breathing through their mouth or when their breathing is fast or labored, and help them practice and learn to get in the habit of saying, hey, how am I breathing? Can I breathe through my nose? Can I soothe my sympathetic nervous system and bring myself back into a present moment state? So that's a very kind of a sidebar and a very practical thing, but it's more than the practices, the yoga practices that help our kids rebuild a sense of safety. What it really is in our teaching is the entirety of the experience that we create in the yoga room. So how much our kids experience a sense of safety in our class is determined not just by the practices we share with them, but how we respond to their behavior, the choices we make about the physical space. It's a lot about the energy you put into making sure they know unequivocally that you're on their side. So let's talk about a few of those more specifically. So some things to consider. The first is language. So language can be used very, very effectively to help cultivate a sense of safety in the yoga room, but language can also be used to control people. Language can also be something that makes kids who've experienced trauma feel like they don't have any control over their own experience. So some things to consider. Very harsh or directive language can be triggering to kids who've experienced trauma. So just for a moment, consider what saying something like, put your hands behind your back could sound like to someone who has a history of abuse. So one way to support a sense of safety when you're teaching yoga is to consider using invitational language. Language like, if you feel ready, bring your hands behind your back, or something like, explore what it would feel like to put your hands behind your back. Now, those sorts of things give kids the opportunity to feel like they're making a decision about what they're doing with their body. But then there's also this catch-22 where sometimes in the room with kids, invitational language can feel like it's going a bit overboard, right, where we get very repetitive and we start to sound kind of wishy-washy, or we're like, if it's okay with you, do this, and why don't you think about doing that? And we just fill the space with a lot of words, and sometimes the kids can start to lose track of what you're asking them to do, and they can feel like not very secure in the fact that you know what you're doing. So what I would suggest to you is that you think about balancing this idea of invitational language with simplicity of language, with very clear, lift your arms over your head. But when you're using that kind of simple, direct language, what you need to make sure of is that the entire vibe, the entire energy, the entire feeling of the class that you teach is in and of itself invitational. Right? So what I mean is your students should always know that they have options and that they don't need to do anything that makes them feel uncomfortable. So the invitational language is something that you want to thread throughout your teaching enough to send that message, and then you also want to explicitly state it early and often. If something doesn't feel right, stop. It doesn't mean if something doesn't feel right, stop and absolutely don't do anything that makes you uncomfortable, right? That's not really what we're going for either. But your kids should know if something doesn't feel right, stop, assess what's going on, notice how you're doing, and make your own decision about whether you need to back off or whether you're ready to move forward. So some things to keep in mind: you always want to give your students options for closing their eyes. You want to use language that welcomes them to do that. You want to, well, I'm starting to go to the next slide, so I'm just going to switch it. You want to consider that as you're moving into postures, there are many postures that might be problematic, not just for kids who've experienced trauma, but even just for kids who are kind of feeling a little bit vulnerable in the world. And it's not always possible to know what poses will affect kids in which ways, but there are some things that we can consider, some general guidelines that we can consider. So clearly any pose that exposes the genitals, such as happy baby, is potentially problematic, as is any pose that makes a child feel trapped. So something like bridge pose with hands interlaced behind the back. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that we don't ever do these poses, but they certainly should not come early on in your relationship with your students, and you want to really consider what postures you choose to do, when, and what alternative options you're giving kids for those postures. I would not introduce any pose that you can kind of know in advance is going to make kids feel vulnerable. Like I said, hip openers and especially back bends where the hands are kind of underneath your back or feel trapped, like you can't respond quickly. I wouldn't introduce any poses like that until I was 100% certain that my students really understood this idea that they don't have to do anything they don't want to do, and you feel like your kids are confident enough in you to make that choice. Like, you know, if they make that choice, they're going to be supported, and you know that they know that. Some other things to consider around safety, closing eyes. So we're often in yoga classes inviting students to close their eyes, but this of course will not feel safe to all kids. So choices should always be offered, and this is a situation where I feel it's important to always offer very specific choices. I don't ever just count on the fact that my kids know, oh, they know that if they don't want to do something, they don't have to. With closing their eyes, I always give them very specific options. Some things that I have found work well for me in my teaching. One is to invite them, if it doesn't feel good to close their eyes, to either look down towards the floor or towards their lap, or to look up and out, but choose a focus point. So it kind of depends what activity you're doing and what the reason for closing eyes is, but looking down seems to minimize distraction. If you're doing some sort of breathwork activity or mindfulness or meditation practice, especially if the kids are set up in a circle, looking down, if they don't feel like closing their eyes, does minimize that feeling that they're staring at each other, right? But then, of course, there's the sort of in the back of my mind that, like, well, what if telling a kid to look down feels really bad for them, feels controlling, is potentially reminding them of some sort of traumatic situation. So I don't even want to be explicitly like, close your eyes or look down. I always give another option of, if that doesn't feel good, just go ahead and find a place to rest your eyes. I have also found that for some of my classes, saying things like, while your eyes are closed, I'll keep my eyes open. I'll keep an eye on your stuff, and I'll let you know if anyone comes in the room. that can help. So it's worth it to think about, well, why do my kids not want to close their eyes? What is it that feels problematic? And think about if you can give them any reassurance. Of course, something like that only works if they trust you, so it's more likely to work once you've developed a bit of a relationship. But I have found that for a lot of my kids, letting them know that I'm keeping my eye on things and I'm definitely going to let them know if anybody comes in the room seems to be something that gives them a little bit more freedom to at least experiment with closing their eyes. Okay, the environment. So your kids who are trauma survivors are going to be especially attuned to the physical environment. They're going to be more sensitive to the physical environment than other kids. So you really want to consider what's going on. Things like what's the lighting like? Are there spaces in the room that feel hidden where the kids can't see what's happening? What is their proximity to doors, to windows? What types of noises are happening in the environment? I've had some kids that I've learned over time just do much, much better in class if I let them sit in a place where they can see the door. Right? I have other kids who don't necessarily need to see the door, but they really feel better if they're close to the door, if they're near the door. And so it's worth it to pay attention to the environment and pay attention to how your kids are doing in that environment. And sometimes just ask them. Right? Just ask them. Your kids who've experienced trauma may also be more distracted by noise than your other kids. So again, you can't always change that. It's not always something you can fix or do anything about, but it's important to be aware of it because if your kid's behavior seems confusing, it seems strange, you're getting that feeling of this kid is driving me nuts again or starting to feel like this is just a bad kid, pay attention. Is that behavior manifesting more often when there are particular things happening in the environment? And sometimes you can start to see those types of patterns. Even if you can't change them or do anything about them, they can give you a little bit more insight and understanding into the behavior so that you can engage more compassionately with it. So, two more things on this list, well actually three more things on this list of topics around the topic of safety. Touch. So touch is a very kind of hot button issue when it comes to talking about working with kids who've experienced trauma or working with people who've experienced trauma in general. Now, some organizations have very strict prohibitions on touch. Others really encourage touch as a form of healing. So I'm not going to tell you one way or the other this is the absolute, but you absolutely must know that touch, even loving touch, can be very uncomfortable for some people and can be downright scary for others, and it always has to be very, very carefully considered. So a couple of guidelines if you are going to choose to use touch, which I recommend you think carefully about that choice. One guideline is don't ever push or pull a child's body into a particular shape. So anytime you place your hands on somebody's body, child, adult, traumatized, not traumatized, you should be thinking, what is my intention? Why am I doing this? And if what you're doing this for is to physically manipulate that kid's body into a different shape, just take your hands off, right? Just find another way and maybe even question, is it actually important that they change the shape of their body right now? So that's one general guideline. And then the other one is, if you choose to use touch in your classes, not only do you need to ask for permission, but I strongly recommend that you develop some sort of opt-in system as opposed to an opt-out system. Right? So I've seen a lot of teachers do things where they'll say, okay, I'm going to come around and give everybody a foot massage or a hand massage, and if you don't want me to touch you, put your hand on your belly, or if you don't want me to touch you, put this bean bag on your belly, or turn over this card or something like that. So basically what they're doing is giving kids the option to opt out of touch. I really discourage you from doing that because, first of all, some kids just straight up won't hear you, right? They'll have been distracted thinking about something else. They won't have heard you. Maybe they'll heard you, but then before they flip the card over or put their hand on their belly, their mind was somewhere else. Right, so there may be kids in the room who actually don't want to be touched, but they missed the window to opt out, and now there you are going over and touching them. Also, some kids are going to think that if the default is everybody gets touched and you have the option to opt out, well, that makes opting out kind of the weird thing. That makes opting out the thing that signals that you're different, that brings attention to you, that maybe makes the teacher think that you don't like them, right? So opting out puts that sort of onus on the kid, right? Opting out makes the kid say, I'm making a choice for myself, regardless of how other people see me or how the teacher sees me. And that's not a choice that every kid is prepared to make authentically. I would say maybe that's a choice that most kids are not prepared to make authentically, even when they haven't experienced trauma. So if you're going to use touch, be very, very thoughtful about it. Not saying never, because some kids really respond incredibly well to some very very carefully thought through, very intentional, very safe touch. But if you're choosing to do that, I would recommend that you have an opt-in system instead, so that the default is nobody gets touched. But if you think a foot massage would feel really great right now and help you relax more, I'm totally willing to be there for you, right? Have an opt-in system. So there's no way that somebody just missed your cue or didn't hear you or didn't really know what they were getting into. So, okay, sorry to harp on that, but it is very important, right? Opt-in, not opt-out. Okay. Two more things about safety. So consistency and predictability. Consistency and predictability are important for all kids to establish a sense of safety, but for kids who've experienced trauma, these things are really essential. So you must try your best to react in the same way to the same things, right? Your responses to kids' behaviors need to be consistent, right? You cannot, you can't react to somebody laying down on their belly in Shavasana with one response one day and a different response the next day, right? If when a kid jumps up really excited and starts talking without raising their hand or waiting their turn, if your response is really enthusiastic and excited one day and really harsh and kind of shut down the next day, those sorts of things are crazy making to kids in general. But for kids who've experienced trauma, they just reinforce this sense that you can't count on anything in the world, right? They cannot figure out how to be safe in an environment that is not consistent. So it's very hard to do it because we're people who have good days and bad days, but we have to try very hard to make sure that our responses to student behavior is very, very consistent, and also that the rhythm of the class is predictable, right? So the kids know what's coming. So my suggestion is that you establish some sort of framework that you can share with your students, right? Every day we do this, 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 and this, and things can change within that framework, but my suggestion is that you have a framework and that when you start working with a new group of kids, you keep things very predictable for quite a while until you start to develop a relationship. And then once the kids get to know you and you get to know the kids, you have a bit more freedom to be creative, to introduce new things, to talk to them about changing the framework. But the framework really, really helps while you're in the relationship building stage. And then the last thing on this list about safety is love. And sometimes I feel self-conscious about kind of shouting the love when I'm talking about working with kids who've experienced trauma. But it's very, very true. It's very real that what makes kids feel safe is love from a caring, competent adult, right? What makes kids feel safe is not necessarily a super safe environment or having everything that they could possibly need around them. Kids are vulnerable, and they know that they're vulnerable. And in their gut and in their heart, kids know that they can't truly be okay unless some competent adult is on their side. Sometimes you will encounter kids who do everything in their power to show you and tell you that that's not true. but they're lying. They're lying. They may believe themselves, but they're coping. They're trying to protect themselves. So my point is just that you have to prove to your students over and over and over again that you're on their side. And some of the very simple things that you can do, one of the most simple, although not easy things to do, is make sure you learn all of your kids' names, right? Know their names. Consider greeting them individually when they come into the class, right? Talk to them using their name and using details that you remember about them. So you're communicating with all of your interactions. I see you and I know exactly who you are. Right? You're not just one of a group here. I am here with you as an individual. Right? I care. When you don't know your kids' names, it's like you just don't quite care enough about them to learn their names. And I'm certainly not saying that's what your intention is, but when that happens, that's often how the kids feel. You also want to consider that if you're really showing kids love, then what that means is when their behavior is terrible, you react with concern rather than disgust, disappointment, anger, and that you're looking in the behavior for the unmet need. Right, that you're looking for the unmet need, that you're reacting with concern, that you're there to support them, not to punish them. And also when you make mistakes, when you're having a bad day, just think about apologize and repair, apologize and repair, right? It's our job as the grown-ups to show kids that they're lovable. It's not their job to make themselves lovable. But when we don't do our job, when we don't remind them that they're lovable just as they are, their primary need for safety forces them to contort themselves into the shapes that they think the grown-ups need them to be in order to be loved. All right. It's always encouraging to me when I look at the research on trauma and see that one of the very consistent predictors of resilience for high-risk kids is a safe, nurturing bond with one single person. Right? Whenever I feel like, oh my gosh, this is too overwhelming, I can't do this, I don't think I can have an impact here, I remind myself of that, that even if the situation is so challenging that I can't like get one yoga pose in. I can be somebody who is safe. I can be somebody who is standing there with this kid, showing them with everything in my being, everything that comes out of my voice, everything that I'm offering them. I can show them that I think that they are worthy of love. And I know in my heart, I know that helps them feel a little bit safer in the world. Okay, I want to pause for a minute and see if anybody has any questions. We only have a short amount of time left, but if there's a burning question, I will answer it.
All right, you guys, if you want to type in any questions that you have, she's covered a lot of information and a lot of really good things for us to consider as we work with children, especially the closed eyes was really interesting to me. And just looking down. So if you've got questions about any of the content so far, type it in. It always takes a couple of seconds for the technology to connect from the far reaches of the world. And I did have kind of one question about how do we prepare our room in the sensory area. Sometimes we have some control over the sensory input that they receive, and sometimes we don't. But if we do have the option, what are some things that we should consider?
That's such a good question. I would consider simplicity, right? So a lot of the time what our kids are reacting negatively to in the environment is an overwhelming amount of sensory input. So if you think about it from the perspective of your system being on high alert, basically every bit of sensory information has to be evaluated for safety, right? How we gather information from the environment, we take it in through our senses. One of the primary things that we're evaluating are does this smell that I'm smelling or sound that I'm hearing or thing that I'm feeling, does this have anything to do with whether I'm safe or not? So when there's a ton of input, then we constantly are stuck in this place of evaluating every little thing for safety. So the system can get really overwhelmed really quickly. So I would say if you have any control over your space at all, think about how you can simplify it and reduce input. This is like a slightly off-topic reference, but one of the things that worked really, really well for me many years ago, I was working with a student who had very severe ADHD, and I actually don't know anything about this child's history of trauma or not. But one of the things that worked really well for me, I was working in a classroom, and I started coming in early and hanging giant white sheets over all the stuff on the walls. That was also a situation where I bought a cheap lamp, and I turned off the fluorescent lights and plugged in a lamp, right? So it took a little bit of effort, and I had to come in early and do this, but it was a kid that I was really struggling with, like almost to the point of like, I don't know if I can be helpful here. And those two things, like changing those two things in the environment, helped a lot. And they made everybody feel better, not just that kid, right? They even made me feel better. But I would say erring on simplicity and reducing sensory input would be the one thing that I would keep in mind if you have control over your environment.
Fabulous. There's one other question here, is how long of the session would you recommend? There's someone that's struggling sometimes at a youth session, facility, that sometimes the sessions are too long, sometimes they're too short. How do you find that happy place of length of time that the kids can engage?
Well, you know, the answer to most good questions is it depends, and this is no exception. I mean, it just depends. I think that our field is still in a place of kind of like, well, I'll take what I can get. At least I know my work is. You know, I don't often have a ton of control over how much time I get with the kids. You know, it's like, okay, well, we're bringing you here for this 20 minutes or this 40 minutes or this hour and 15 minutes. And I think you basically have to overplan. Well, I'll tell you what I do is I overplan, and then I in advance plan what I'm going to drop if I don't have enough time, or if I feel like the kid is not necessarily engaged by what I'm offering. So I like plan in advance. If the time doesn't work, if I don't have enough time, what am I going to let go of? And then I'm basically prepared to let go of everything. And you know, I wish I had a clearer answer for you, but I think the real answer is you just have to stay in the present moment and stay fully connected to your kids and be willing to meet their needs. So if you feel like you have all this time, too much time, and you can't keep the kids engaged that long, then you think about things that connect to what you're doing that engage them in a different way. So maybe you incorporate things like some discussion stuff in the beginning of every session, and a journaling or art project at the beginning of every session, and you kind of fill the space with things that are connected, that are appropriate, but that give the kids a little bit of inward time.
All right, fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, so I am going to go forward and talk about agency. Right, so agency is something that is really taken away from a lot of people when they experience trauma. And agency is our belief in our own power, in our own capacity to make changes in our experience of our life. And if you think about what happens during a traumatic situation, basically your power is taken away, right? Your control over your own circumstances are taken away. And this can be very devastating to our kind of fundamental foundational belief that we have agency in our lives. So I think the yoga practice is a really wonderful place to help kids rebuild this sense of agency, because we see things so clearly, right? Like my body feels this way, and then I push my heels down and I change something in my body and I change how I feel. I change my experience. So that's a very, kind of small specific example, but there are many, many examples in the yoga practice of how we can reconnect to our sense of agency and even practice having agency. So I think for me, when I think about working with kids who've experienced trauma, I try to keep in my mind, okay, how can I rebuild their sense of agency as relates to their own physical body? And also, how can I provide them experience of agency in relationship? Right? So how can, through my relationship with this child, how can I prove to them that their voice matters? right? That their voice is important and will be respected. So there are three things that I keep in mind when I'm thinking about agency. So the first is embodiment, right? Is embodiment. And embodiment is about connection to your felt experience, or being able to notice what's happening in your body and being able to use your body as a resource. We could spend like the whole hour talking about embodiment and much longer than that. But my recommendation, what I think is important to communicate to you guys now in this short time, is that when you're teaching yoga, especially when you're teaching asana, it's so important with your kids that you focus on the felt experience that they're having and on the capacity that they have within their body, and move very, very far away from a focus on the exterior, a focus on how the pose looks, and stay grounded in this understanding of what the body is experiencing. Now, I know that, I feel convinced that most people who are teaching kids yoga have heard that or know that, but it's so easy to get away from it. It's so easy to inadvertently, with our language, put out there things like, bend your knee until your thigh is parallel to the ground, and think, oh, we're not taking away agency, right? But your kid can be completely disconnected from their body and just do exactly what you're saying. So go back to kind of thinking about language and say, okay, what would be an embodied way to say that? And maybe something like, bend your knee until you can feel your leg muscles working would be a good choice for a replacement, right? So using your language when you're teaching the poses to encourage kids to explore their internal experience instead of using external references to help them figure out how to get into the shapes. And so we have to infuse the actual practice of the poses with this sense of exploration, of curiosity, with an attunement to how the body is feeling and working, and of course with kindness towards our bodies. So embodiment, and then choice. So choice is at the core of agency, right? And trauma takes away choices. It takes away power. To be trauma sensitive in our teaching, I think about this as all the time, how can I give my kids back some control over their own body? I mentioned this earlier, but students should be told early and often that if something doesn't feel right, stop, assess what's going on with you, and make your own decision about what to do moving forward. What we as teachers need to recognize is that when our kids do that, we're probably going to be a little bit annoyed unless we're really, really aware that this is what I'm asking for, this is what I'm going for, right? Because class is easier for us. Things go more smoothly if everyone just does what we say, right? But when kids start making choices to back off, to move forward, to change, it threatens our sense of stability and our sense of control over the class. So that's like that sensitivity, that really being present with what your goals are for your kids will help you in that space. I think that we need to also all recognize that some kids have a very, very high motivation to do whatever they think you want them to do, even if it's harming them. Right, so kids who will come into a pose and stay there even though it hurts because they think that that will make you like them better. Right? You have to overemphasize this point of choice, this point of back off, make a decision about whether to move forward or to back off. Reinforce that message by saying things like, I'm so glad you recognized that this wasn't working for you and made another choice. That's exactly what we're going for. Now you have to make decisions knowing your kids about whether you want to say that privately to them or whether you want to say that in front of the group. Some kids, even if you're saying something good about them, bringing attention to them will make them feel embarrassed and ashamed. So you have to use your judgment there. But the basic point is that you can tell your kids they have a choice, but if you don't really act like you're supporting those choices when they make them, they're not going to believe that it is their right to make them, and that if they make them, they can still be safe. If they make a choice that's not what you're hoping for, they can still be safe. So you really have to stay in that place of recognizing that for what it is and emphasizing the positive aspects of it when it happens. I think a good general plan, a good practice is when you're working with a new group of kids for the first time, spend a little bit of time with them to establish a couple of poses that they can explore and decide if they feel like really good, strong, safe places for them. So maybe like a strong seated pose, child's pose, shavasana, like find some poses for that group that feel like safe places to rest, and always remind the kids, oh, if anything doesn't feel right, you can always come back to child's pose or seated pose or whatever it is that you decided was going to be a good resting place for you. And then finally, we cannot talk about trauma and kids and not talk about play. Right? Playfulness is the primary learning vehicle of childhood, and for kids who are trauma survivors, often their natural playfulness is stripped from them, and something important is stolen, not just joy, but play is how kids experiment and explore the world. Play is how kids learn. So when the capacity to be playful is taken from them, it's not just that, oh, they're not having a happy childhood, which, you know, is not okay, but also that this vehicle for exploring the world, discovering what they're capable of, learning about how to interact with other people, none of that is happening when kids can't play. So I just want to remind you to bring a spirit of playfulness into your work, even in the most challenging, the most traumatic, the most horrible of circumstances. You're still working with kids, so you have to infuse a spirit of lightness, of playfulness into the work. Laughter and play is also a great way to foster community connection. Right? When kids laugh together, it creates a sense of safety and cohesion in the group. Right? Laughing together is kind of like saying, like, haha, I get it, you get it, we all get it, but we don't have to talk about it. Right? And it's a way to build bonds of safety in a group. Now, sometimes people say things to me like, well, what about when one little group of kids is laughing at another kid, right? That's not about safety. That's not about creating a bond. Well, it sucks, but it kind of is, because it's always one little group of kids laughing at another kid, right? You almost never see one kid laughing at another kid. You see a little group, and that little group is trying to create bonds of safety and community within themselves. So I think for us, if we can come in with this intention and practice of cultivating playfulness and laughter within the big group, then we very much reduce the need of those little groups to create their own circles of laughter. So yeah, that's kind of the final piece for you guys tonight. Right? Play lets traumatized kids reconnect with the spirit of childhood and move forward on a path of learning that is natural for them. So there's lots more to say, but our hour is up. So I will end there. I have a couple of minutes. I'm not sure, Donna, what the protocol is here, but I'm happy to answer a couple of questions if there's time.
All right. We can probably only have time for one. I know I'm a little squished tonight, and so I apologize for that. There was one question earlier, and it was, how, if you suspect you know something about a child's trauma history, how do you communicate it with their parents and or caregivers if they are unaware of what's going on?
So I just want to make sure I understand the question. Are you saying if like a child tells you something about a traumatic experience?
It could be that, or it could be that you know something, right? Sometimes we just know things, whether we've been told directly or we just know these things.
No, yeah. This is a situation where you really have to be careful, because there are things that we know and there are things that we think we know, and there are things that we are looking at through a lens that is our own particular lens, comprised of everything we know and don't know in the world. So I've had experiences of this, of like feeling something was wrong and not knowing what to do, or knowing for sure, and I've actually had to, on 2 separate occasions, officially report abuse, and it sucks. It really sucks. But what I would encourage is that you seek professional help and support. I think if you're working in a school environment, you should absolutely take advantage of the resources that are available to you and go speak with the school counselor before you go directly to a parent. That can seem terrible, especially as a parent. I mean, I'm a parent, and if someone knew something about my kid, I would want them to tell me the second they knew it. But we don't always know what the repercussions and the ramifications of what we say might be. So sometimes we can inadvertently put a kid in greater danger by talking to their parent about something that we think we understand, but maybe we don't. So I would say professionally, my recommendation would be that you if possible, reach out to somebody who is trained to do this. Yes. So you can, that might be a school counselor. It gets a lot harder if you're working in a studio environment or you're working in like a private, like in someone's home where you're doing like a private or a small group private, or you're in a studio, you don't have those sorts of resources. I would, if you're in a studio situation or a situation where you feel like there really is nobody to go to in any sort of official capacity, depending on what it is, I would really consider reaching out to DCFS, to the Department of Child and Family Services, or I know people are from all over on this call, to whatever the official kind of agency or channels are. If there's any possibility, if you can conceive of like any possibility that the information you're bringing to a parent might be received with anything less than like full-blown like love and concern. If one kid is bullying another kid or something like that, talk to the parents. But if there's anything that there's even a glimmer of like this is a real dangerous situation for the kid at home, then I wouldn't try to talk to the parents directly yourself. That might hurt your heart. It sometimes hurts my heart, but it's usually, I think, the smarter way to go.
All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, your expertise. You can always send questions to Jennifer directly. And we have a draw for a fabulous book. So this is Jen's new book, and we're going to be sending this off to Tracy Stringer. Now, Tracy, congratulations. I think you have been on almost every single webinar since Kids Yoga Academy started, and it's about high time that you won something. So you're getting Jennifer's book. Congratulations. All right, so everybody knows I will be sending a recording out of this event in your follow-up email. It'll probably come in about 2 days. I am slammed in the next 2 days off at a conference first thing in the morning tomorrow. Here's a whole bunch of recommended reading from Jennifer. So if you missed any part of this evening, don't worry, you'll get the recording along with a copy of the slides and your certificate of attendance. So that is coming to you, and Tracy says, woo, woo, thanks, and many people have said they've just absolutely loved the webinar. So I appreciate your time. It has been excellent, says somebody. Thank you so much. I've learned tons. So really great to have your feedback.
Thank you.
Appreciate it so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. And here's my contact info, so be in touch anytime. Thanks so much, everybody.
Right. Have a wonderful evening. Namaste.
Good night.